We are back. Hopefully everybody had a good day.
I'm hoping
everyone's waiting for happy
hour. There we go.
Clearly.
Okay. It took a little bit. What I think is so cool about doing multiple cities is you really sort of start to understand, where the different pockets of innovation lie, but also, who's doing what, where, and where are they in terms of maturity. And what I loved seeing here is how involved you all are in terms of understanding what the business is doing, and then how does that translate to IT. And also, how do you get your engineers a little bit more mature and take them along on that journey culturally as well. So first of all, is that something that you've also experienced? I'd love to know that, just from your point of view. Have you noticed any trends evolving over the day?
Oh, that's a good question. That's interesting. It's so varied because I feel like we get to see such an interesting broad spectrum. I think one of the fun parts of the role is because it's so cross-cutting, across industries, across sort of geographies, you kind of get to see it all. I think what feels pretty consistent is it's oftentimes by vertical you can see the most distinction, right? I think it tends to be pretty, I think particularly it's obviously the software companies were first movers to go to cloud, and then behind that maybe retail was maybe next, and there's sort of the cascade. So I think you see a pretty consistent maturity curve. And then I think within each market, you sort of have the folks that kind of are setting the pace, and then people who are sort of defining for the rest of the market. Hey, here's the pattern. Here's how we're doing it. Oftentimes, it's people sort of talking and sharing. So like this morning, we had Stefan from Lufthansa. That was awesome. I think it's been great partnership for many years. And then you got to see sort of the companies that have sort of followed them on that same journey, right, and sort of learned from what they've done. So I think that part of it's been really cool to kind of see that evolution of the early customers defining the motion in the market, and then sort of seeing that same pattern progress to other industries or other people in the same industry.
Yeah. So then, follow-up question. As you see the market progress and you see kind of platform teams come and become a little bit more predominant and establish their own best practices, aside from efficiency, which we've talked a lot about today, what are some other benefits that you might see in terms of platform team and platform engineering in general?
Honestly, I want to bring Stefan back up practically for the stats he shared this morning because I thought they were so perfect. I think it's a lot of people obviously start with some of the cost and think about it through the OpEx lens, and I think the stat he shared was great. It's like, hey, what took 450 people, we can now do with 100 people because we have more consistency and more automation. But I thought the other side of it was just as equally interesting, which was, okay, but now we can actually manage it from 6 months on a deployment down to 2 days to do the same deployment, and we can manage even more infrastructure, faster. So to me, there's the speed of an ability to sort of innovate, and so that, okay, if you imagine a project takes you 6 months, that also starts to impact the business itself. It's not just an IT thing. It becomes, okay, well, how many customers can we realistically onboard if it takes us 6 months at a time versus if it takes us 2 days? Okay, it changes the business conversation. So to me, I think there's a speed aspect. The thing we didn't super have time to get into, I think there's a risk element of it as well, which is, okay, well, what does it look like to actually manage compliance and risk if you have 500 teams that did it in 500 unique ways versus if I have a platform team to define it one way, I can build all my controls, do it in a consistent way. Then when you think about it from a security team's perspective, it makes their life that much easier. You're governing it in one way rather than 500 ways.
Yeah, I think you're dead on. And, when I was running my own security team back in the day, one of the things that we had a really hard time with was figuring out what was running where, to the extent that I myself spun up some shadow IT, and we didn't know what was running in there. And that was, a major CVE was released during that time. And I literally woke up in the middle of the night and went, oh my God, what's going to happen now? So I think, to your point, that security and risk play a huge part there. So while we're on security and risk, I'm very curious to hear your input in terms of, what are some of the best practices when it comes to secret scanning, and how would you go ahead and implement part of that as part of your program and eventually part of your platform team?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it sort of ties into actually, why we ultimately ended up building, buying the Vault Radar product. I think when we built Vault, back in 2015 was when we first released it. Our view was, hey, you're going to build a secret store. You'll build the right process around, onboarding all of your application secrets into it, build the right workflows around it, and then the problem is done. And then what we quickly figured out is that's not true, because the assumption in there is that your users are perfect and that your applications are perfect. And both of those are really bad assumptions. Because very quickly what we saw is like, great, even we put all of our secrets in Vault, but then you imported some library in your Rails app that thing for some reason is logging every environment variable out to standard out. So, okay, great. The moment the Rails app boots, it reads the credentials from Vault, and then this random library that you didn't even know about, nested somewhere as a sub-dependency, logs all your secrets, and now they're in Datadog. And you're like, well, how did those get there? And you go through the whole investigation, and you're like, oops, this random module somebody imported, right? Or it's like, the other one we found was, a customer, somehow someone had connected an automation pipeline to Slack that talked to Vault, and it's through a webhook. And it turned out that this webhook was also ingesting the Vault tokens and pasting it into Slack as well. No. So you were like, okay, great. Now you have all these Vault tokens in Slack because the user was like, oh, it was so inconvenient. I didn't want to log in. It was easier. Every morning I come in, it's in my Slack. You're like, yeah, it's in everyone else's Slack too. So what we found is like, okay, even if you perfectly Vault, it doesn't really help you because you have this continuous surface area that's sort of leaking all the credentials back out. So we sort of looked at the space and said, okay, should we, and then the third piece of this was actually for our enterprise customers who'd ask us, great, we have Vault, we love it, but we don't actually even know where all of our secrets are in the estate. So can you actually tell us where they are so that we know what we need to import into the Vault to begin with? So we sort of looked at it and said, actually, you kind of have two different problems. Day one, you might say, I stood up my Vault, I need an inventory. Show me where everything is. What's in GitHub, what's in Jira, what's in Confluence, what's in Slack. So I at least know my starting point. Now I can build a roadmap that says, okay, here's my 10,000 secrets, go import all of those. You do that day one, hopefully you get it from 10,000 down to 0. And then you have to keep running because the developers and the applications keep leaking it into everything else as you go. So I think about it as there's the inventory, which is an upfront day 0 thing, and then there's the continuous scanning and monitoring because you're never done, right? And it's part of a cleanup effort that you sort of are forever doing.
Amen. All right, I'm always happy to monopolize your time, but I do want to open it up to the audience. Are there any questions out in the audience that you have? Oh, okay, well, that was quick. Right here in the middle, Maud, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I have a question about the new licensing terms of Terraform. I know it's a sensitive topic. Have you seen any decrease in contributions on Terraform, and how is HashiCorp planning to offset that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe just I'll give context for a whole audience. So we changed our license from sort of the Mozilla public license to the business source license, BSL, last August. And we did it not just for Terraform, but across the entire HashiCorp portfolio. And the real core of that license change was ultimately a handful of small ISVs. They were basically saying, they were funded in kind of 2019, 2020, different startup environment, easy to raise money. And their core business model was basically, we'll package up the HashiCorp IP, put a thin UI layer around it, and sell it against HashiCorp for 50 cents on the dollar. And it was never, I think, going to be a long-term viable business model. The pitch from their own investors was that HashiCorp should buy them, and because we got outreach from all of their investors. But it was a nuisance, and ultimately it created sort of this incentive to go kind of create this noise in the market. So we changed our license to basically say, if you're using our products as an end user, great, no impact to you, keep doing whatever you're doing. If you're a partner who's integrating with us, great, no impact to you, keep doing what you're doing. If you're packaging our products and selling it commercially, you can't do that anymore under the business source license without a commercial agreement from us. And we have a bunch of resale partners and OEM partners and things like that who have commercial agreements with us. And so it impacts really, I would call it less than a dozen probably vendors in the world were impacted directly by the licensing change, right? No impact to customers. They're free to keep doing whatever they're doing. And end users. So that was really the core of it. The reality is of the, we had, hundreds of people sign the pledge that we should turn back our license and whatever. We did an audit of all the people on that, the 300 OpenTofu sponsors. Of them, a grand total of 2 people had ever contributed to Terraform's code base. And of those, one was a doc fix and the other was a typo. So when you really say, what was the impact to true product innovation? Okay, there was a typo in one of our comments. Okay, fine, we lost out on that contribution. But when you really look at the core heavy lift of who's actually building Terraform, building the SDKs, building the ecosystem, that whole lift was HashiCorp, right? So the practical reality of it is no real change in terms of sort of the innovation engine and sort of the impact from contributions. This has kind of always been the case. If you really look at all of our projects, it's not just a Terraform statement. really 99.99% of the core of whether it's Vault or Terraform has always been developed by the committers and the maintainers at HashiCorp themselves. It's our ecosystem of providers where Terraform has 4,000 of them today. Vault has, I don't know, 200 of them, where a lot of that lift is where we go from the community. Now, even within that, most of it comes from our technology partners. It's working closely with the Ciscos of the world, the Red Hats of the world, the Amazons and Azures and Googles of the world. And a lot of that work is actually done by our partners, and we have a formal technology alliances group that we work closely with them. We certify their providers. We do sort of testing with them nightly. So most of that community lift actually happens through our technology partnerships. So maybe a very long-winded way of saying we haven't really seen any impact from an open source contribution perspective. We haven't seen any impact from downloads. In fact, we continue to hit all-time highs, month over month. So sort of, really the biggest impact is if you were one of the half a dozen vendors that were packaging our products to sell against us. That was it. Cool. Good question, though. Other questions? Oh, a bunch. Okay. We'll let you pick, Mod.
Hello, Ivan Kukulevsky. So today we didn't have any topics about AI and integration with HashiCorp. So question for you, maybe you can share some roadmap about HashiCorp product and integration with AI for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I know, isn't it amazing? You can go to a tech conference and every other word's not AI. It's magic. The way I think about it is we have sort of three horizons as we think about AI. The first horizon is sort of how are we using it internally. So we're pretty big users of Copilot. So we're big GitHub customers. We're leveraging it. We've rolled it out to our whole development organization. So internally we look at it and say, hey, I think we can improve productivity, probably 5 to 15%, right? Using some of those AI techniques. We're doing some internal code generation and some internal auto test generation, some other things like that around some of the Terraform frameworks and SDKs that we maintain. So we're leveraging some of those techniques in terms of how do we make our dev team more efficient. That's kind of horizon one. Horizon two is how do we integrate AI into our product experience and deliver that as part of just feature sets in the product. So we announced, for example, automatic test generation with Terraform modules in HCP Terraform. So if you create a module in Terraform, you can basically publish it to the registry, and there's a little button that says generate tests for me, and that's powered by GPT behind the scenes to basically be able to auto-generate tests. So there's a bunch of other pilots of use cases we're working on in terms of some natural language interfaces to different products, making it easier to, for example, access our audit logs. So today it's a sort of standard structured audit log format, but giving things like a conversational interface to be like, hey, who was the last person who changed this secret in Vault? Right? So there's things like that we're working on that will show up and manifest as features. That's kind of the horizon two, if you will, of like AI-driven capabilities within the products. Then horizon three is sort of customers who are building AI-based applications. Sort of how do we help them? What's the impact there? How do they leverage it? So one of the biggest use cases we see is customers want to use sort of code generation techniques for tools like Terraform. So we're partnering and we work closely with Amazon. We announced our integration with Code Whisperer. We work closely with Azure around the GPT, and then we work with Google on Vertex and Gemini. So with all of them, we provide training data and enablement, and we do prompt engineering with them to improve the Terraform code generation. So all three of them have sort of first-class support. So you can say, hey, write me Terraform module for an S3 bucket or whatever, and Code Whisperer can auto-generate that. So we're doing a bunch of work with them because our view is you're not going to buy a dedicated thing that just does Terraform for code generation. You're going to buy something more general purpose like Copilot, and you just want Copilot to have first-class support. So we're working with them to improve that. So that's kind of piece one. Piece two is around customers spinning up environments to actually leverage these things. And that's where we're working with the cloud providers on sort of landing zones to say, hey, you're going to Amazon and you want SageMaker and Bedrock and S3 and a Jupyter Notebook and et cetera. What does that landing zone look like to help you kind of quick start into an environment to let you build on top of those things and bring all the components? Because these things are complicated. It's never like one resource. It's usually lots of things you need to kind of have a functioning AI environment. So that's kind of like piece two. And then piece three, is on the data side of it. So when we think about sort of the model training, model building, a big problem is these LLMs tend to memorize the input data, right? So when we look at that, the best way you solve that is by tokenizing the data before it gets used for training. So that's where you can use things like Vault to actually do data tokenization, data transformation. So you can take your customer data, transform and tokenize it, use that as the training set, but then if the LLMs memorize some of that data, it doesn't end up memorizing sensitive customer data. Right, it can be sort of a token that is less sensitive in that sense. So it's really looking at that third horizon of how do you enable customers to actually build and train and deploy these models as well. So hopefully that gives a sense.
Up here, it looks like there's a question.
Hi. Do you plan to backport the radar feature to self-hosted Vault Enterprise?
Okay, good question. Asking the hard ones, I see.
They're not letting you off the hook today.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, good question. So I think what we were trying to solve for is ultimately what we want to get to is we want to solve for the challenge I think a lot of customers have in private data centers where IP shouldn't leave the premise. And what you'll see us introduce in the coming kind of months here is what we're calling a gateway for radar. So you can basically run your own gateway that will live on your network, on your premise. You self-manage that. The gateway will be the piece that will do all of the scanning. It would be the ones that actually would see any of the sensitive data and would live on your premise. And then the only things that would come to the cloud would just be the metadata and pointers rather than any of the actual IP comes to us, none of the scanning, none of the source material, none of the secrets even. So it'd really be providing more of the UI layers and some of the management layers and having that be tightly integrated into the HCP portal. And the reason for that is to be able to deliver kind of a consistent integrated experience across HCP. So you can say, great, I want to take that secret and import it into my vault as an example, right? And so there's a bunch of capabilities that make more sense for us to be able to cloud deliver. Things like the vault correlation, for example, requires us to maintain a bunch of index tables that go over time. And it becomes tedious, I think, for customers to self-manage that. So I think that will be sort of the solution we want to move towards is ultimately having the hybrid gateway and then over time enhancing that with things like bring your own key support and things like that. Now, I don't want to totally rule out that in time we might have a fully self-managed, self-contained option. We haven't committed to that yet. We want to sort of get to this hybrid thing next and enable that and then see how far we can push that before we consider going to a fully self-managed one. But good question. I think there might be a question
Yeah,
at the same table.
can you just repeat the question, Armon, before answering it? Because it seems not everyone here from the back.
Sure, yeah, of course, yeah. Was there another question at that table?
Hi, I'm using Vault's enterprise version for many years, and today I learned there is or there will be a long time support version. My question is, what is the benefit of a long time support single binary version application?
Yeah, great question. So for the folks who might not have heard, question was basically if, effectively what's the benefit of the long-term support, the LTS releases of a product like Vault, effectively. So the way I think about it is if you look at our historical sort of support view, the way we've always stated the HashiCorp support policy is we support the current version and the last two major versions. So we just released Vault 1.18, I think, 1.17, which means we support 1.17, 1.16, and 1.15 as officially supported, right? Now, the challenge is our release process is about every 4 months. So even if you're running 1.15, that's only about a year ago that release came out. And so if you're running anything older than a year, basically, we're not backporting fixes to you. You're outside of our official support policy window. If there's a security vulnerability, there's no guarantee it gets backported. So I think that puts pressure on customers to basically say, okay, every year I'm having to do at least one major version upgrade, right? So I'm going to have to do the testing, validation, make sure that I didn't break anything, all of that, kind of testing and QA that goes into those upgrades. I think what we've heard from a lot of our customers who operate Vault at large scale, they're like, that can be very hard, right? If I'm integrating Vault into 10,000 endpoints, we have customers that run 100,000 containers talking to Vault. They're like, doing a major version upgrade is a big deal because we have to revalidate it didn't break any of these 100,000 containers that we're running across. And so we'd prefer not to do that super often. We definitely don't want to do it twice a year. So the value of the long-term support is we've basically said, great, once a year we'll designate an LTS release. And for a 2-year period of time, not just N-2, but for 2 calendar years, we'll support that release. And we'll do backporting of security fixes and bug fixes and hardening. And then we'll let you skip all the middle releases. So that way, if you're skipping 2 years ahead and there might have been, 6 releases in the meantime, you don't have to test an upgrade path between 6 different versions. You can go from one LTS direct to the other LTS, and we'll do all the testing and hardening to make sure you're allowed to skip LTS to LTS. Because not all of our version upgrades actually let you do that. For the most part, we actually require that you go sequentially. So if you're on .14, you have to go 15 to 16 to 17. So if you're 2 years behind, you're doing 8 upgrades in a row, right? That could be super painful. So that's the value of the LTS. It makes it just a lot easier to operate. The upgrades a bit easier. You don't have to do them as frequently, right? And you still can stay patched and supported for that whole window. That's why. So hopefully that helps.
I have a two-part question. So the first part is, do you see verticalizing templates in Waypoint? So per industry, for example, so they can be easily adopted, because at the end of the day, that's going to be part of the how much people adopt it. Yeah. And the second part is a little bit more cheeky, but if you see that using Terraform, like HCP Terraform, you can actually now have visibility of everything that gets deployed. Yeah. With that knowledge, will you use something like a machine learning model? Let's not call it an LLM. To actually understand which will be the most valuable templates to create on Waypoint?
Yeah, okay, 2 very good questions. So maybe I'll start with the second question and then we can move backwards. So I think on the second question, I think one of the big things we'd like to do is create sort of a common, let's call it a data lake, for lack of a better term, that would have all of the resources managed by Terraform, as well as over time, all of the resources in your multi-cloud estate in sort of a common visibility. Because I think this will start to enable workflows like, hey, show me what resources aren't being managed by Terraform today, and let me import those things in. Show me things that are outside of policy or have drift, even if they're not managed by Terraform. So once you have that common data lake, you can apply a number of different techniques. Some of them might be ML-driven, some of them might be LLM-driven, some of them might just be simple heuristics, which is, hey, everything should be managed by Terraform. Why are these 500 resources not managed by Terraform? So you can build a bunch of different kind of rules engines. I think in some sense it becomes more about a focus on what's the business problem you're solving, whether it's a compliance one, whether it's a risk problem, whether it's a cost optimization. I think you'd look at it through the list of those business use cases, and then you'd use the best tool for the job. For some of them, like cost, an LLM might be the best technique. We can pattern match and say, hey, actually you have all these larges, those should be medium sizes. You don't need all that. This is a bunch of waste. So, but I think what matters is the business value is, hey, you did cost optimization, right? So I think that's kind of the direction we're going to drive this stuff, is to create common visibility across all of it, and then think about it through the lens of cost optimization, risk management, compliance management, et cetera, and then use the right technique for the job. Now, going backward a little bit to the first question was the verticalization of the templates. You know what I think is interesting is actually it's less about verticalization of templates, because they're almost the same. Like there's really not much of a difference between what manufacturing needs versus energy versus a financial versus et cetera. On the template side, the infrastructure almost all looks the same. What's different is on the policy side. So if I think about it from a policy as code perspective, if I'm, a general purpose retailer, most organizations, I might care about PCI or ISO compliance. If I'm a public company in the US, I might care about SOC controls. If I'm, if I'm a financial entity, I have a certain set of financial regulators depending on what country I'm in with different requirements. So to me, I think about it as actually it's the policy and governance side that's where it's more verticalized. And I think there's an opportunity to create verticalized, security policies. If you're in public sector, you care about FedRAMP or common criteria or something else. So to me, that's where I think the infrastructure almost always looks the same, but you're going to apply different policy controls. And I think over time, that's where we want to focus. We've already introduced some policy as code with CIS, the sort of more of a standard benchmark. And then on Tuesday, we announced our strategic collaboration agreement with Amazon, where we're going to start to build out a set of those verticalized policies with Sentinel on AWS. And I think you'll see us do more of that across other cloud providers and across other verticals as well. Cool, good question. Other questions? I know I saw some other hands.
Thank you. I think we're one of the few companies here that use your beautiful product Nomad. And I wanted to know what's in store there in the future, because I was really happy to see in the keynote that the founder spot, even a small announcement, is more than we guys are used to. So yeah, what's the strategy there? How will it keep competing with Kubernetes?
It's a great question. So I think the first clarification is we don't necessarily think about it as a compete necessarily with Kubernetes. We think about it as they both solve. I mean, some of it can be similar if we're running generic kind of Linux container workloads. But I think we think about it as sort of solving a different set of problems, right? So, actually the piece I'm super excited about, and some of this is driven by obviously our announcement with IBM here, is I think there's a lot more we can be doing with Nomad, and even in the near term, we're sort of growing the team to invest more heavily there. I think one of the most interesting opportunities ahead of us is, I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of people have is, you might have been a big VMware customer, now you're a Broadcom customer, and now your bill went up 500%. And a lot of people didn't like that. So I think there's this interesting opportunity as people think about, well, what could be a next generation platform to manage my VMs at scale? And how can that help me to go not only just manage VMs in my private data center, but actually really be a hybrid cloud platform? Nomad's almost perfectly suited for this. So it already has a multi-driver architecture. It already can support VM and container and non-container workloads. And so we're really focusing there to say, okay, well, what hardening is needed now to really be able to go deep in terms of VM support, being able to do things like live migration, be able to manage block storage devices, file storage devices, and be able to tightly integrate those so that you can both say, on-prem, I can manage that, same control plane to deploy VMs and containers, and then I can use the same control plane to expand from private data center into cloud and really be able to have a hybrid management story. So I'm actually really excited about Nomad. We're continuing to double down and invest in it. I think it has I think there's a bunch of challenges as we think about, the existing VMware environment that we can help customers migrate to, which can then drive a lot of net new Nomad users. So I think there'll be a lot more to come on Nomad. But great question. One of my favorite products. Probably my favorite product.
So many good questions.
Yeah, great ones. I saw a few other hands. I don't know if everyone's just waiting for happy hour now.
So yeah, my question would be, if you would basically have to start from scratch building your products, would you still build on-prem or self-hosted solutions? And like to provide some context, so I work for Celonis, we're a SaaS company, so we built our product cloud first, and now we do have a lot of big enterprise customers who are asking for self-hosted on-prem software. And I mean, the idealist in me likes to say, they probably want certain regulatory or compliance needs to be addressed that we could probably address in the cloud by building the right product. And yeah, I'd just be curious about your thoughts on that.
It's a super good question. And I wish I had a nice answer. Here's the reality of it. I think we'd all like to believe everything's just going to go cloud and life is easy. We just deploy everything as a SaaS. I think what we've found is the real world's just a lot messier than that, right? You have a lot of industries where they're fundamentally offline, right? They're a manufacturing plant that has to be designed to operate without the internet. They're a hospital that has to work without the internet. They're a submarine that's, underwater for 6 months at a time, right? And so there's a bunch of these types of environments where fundamentally you have to assume you're cloud disconnected. You can't assume you're cloud connected at all times. And I don't think those environments are going to go away. At the same time, I think we live in a lot more complicated landscape now from a regulatory standpoint. I think like 3-4 years ago was actually a lot easier. I think you're seeing an acceleration of data regulation laws and data sovereignty laws across the world that are making it a lot harder to actually do some of those things. Where before it'd be like you run one SaaS in the US region and that was fine, that doesn't really work anymore, right? And so I think you might say some regions end up being big enough, like Europe, where you can say, okay, well, you'll operate a separate SaaS in Europe. But are you going to have a separate SaaS in 175 countries? No, it becomes impractical from a cost perspective at a certain point, right? What makes the EU work is a common regulatory set of regimes. When you look at Asia, it's actually a very different problem because APJ is not really one legal construct. So Singapore's laws to India's laws to Australia to Japan, where would you put a region? You need 15 regions now. So I think the reality ends up becoming self-managed almost becomes the only answer to that because it gives you an out to say, okay, well, I'm not going to run 50 of the cloud SaaS environments, especially if some of them are too small to cover even the operating cost. You'll be losing money operating there, but self-managed becomes a viable path. So I think that becomes the reality is I don't think hybrid's going anywhere. So I think, knowing what I know now, would I do things differently? Probably. I think there's some slight architectural decisions I would make differently to make it easier to manage both a self-managed and cloud because a lot of what we built started as pure self-managed. Then we built it as cloud, and so we didn't design it thinking about cloud back in 2011. So there's design decisions I'd do differently, but I'd fundamentally still be designing for hybrid. Why don't we go all the way to the back?
So thank you very much. My name is Musa. I'm from Fresenius. I want to ask again one question that was maybe partially answered. It is the movement that we have at the moment around OpenTofu and Terraform. Do you feel yourself threatened by this movement? This is the first question. The second question is about one of your products that you also highlight today, Waypoint. My team and myself are thinking that this is no more a tool, but more than a transformation into the company. Do you see it also being like this? And is it for HashiCorp on the roadmap of HashiCorp basically now putting more effort into Waypoint? And if this is the case, how can you ensure companies to take this way?
Okay, yeah, two good questions. So maybe on the OpenTofu one quickly, no, put simply, no, we don't really see it as a threat. I think they're going to have a hard time keeping up with our innovation. The entire community is still based on Terraform. If I look at our downloads, we probably do over 1 million downloads a week to their 10, right? So, I think they've promised to maintain a fork with perfect compatibility. The reality of those things is you run into a handful of issues pretty quick, which is one, how do you maintain the same development velocity as us without copying our code, as we've seen them already do, and we sent a cease and desist. So you either end up in IP infringement because you're trying to copy us, or you have to have a staff that's just as big as ours. And then 3, you have patent infringement issues. So as we continue to innovate and patent the work we're doing, it's very hard to maintain parity with the Terraform ecosystem. So over time, they'll be forced to diverge, and all of a sudden you have 99.99% of the users on Terraform and 0.01 on Tofu. So good luck with that community, right? So no, I don't really spend much time thinking about them. On the Waypoint side, I think it's a great question. I think to your point on transformation, I think the bigger issues there is actually really the bigger cultural shift to me is moving away from an ITIL or ClickOps model into more of an infrastructure as code automated delivery set of challenges. And I think that's a big organizational transformation, right? Because it's a totally different mindset. It's almost a different skill set. It's a different operating model when you're going from filing tickets and pointing and clicking into thinking about it as being driven by all code, all automation. So I think that's the biggest shift is I think even as people adopt things like Terraform, it is an org transformation. And we see that. And frankly, I think that's one of the bigger things orgs struggle with is it's a reskilling. It's a different way of working. It's a different operating model. I think Waypoint on top of that really is then more about lowering the bar in some sense, right? So, if I think about an organization going through a maturity curve, step 1 is you're adopting infrastructure as code. Step 2, you're identifying a set of reusable patterns and building modules and templates that are based on that. And then step 3 is really with Waypoint where you're saying, okay, how do I take that and make it even easier for developers so they don't even have to learn Terraform. They don't have to do a GitOps pipeline. They can go in through a simpler interface with Waypoint. So it's almost kind of turbocharging the work that was already done to get to infrastructure as code and get to those shared modules. It's about making it more accessible to a big organization. Because I think what we end up seeing is you take a large organization, maybe it has 5,000 developers. You might train 100, 200, 500 people on Terraform. They're the core platform teams. They understand cloud. They're the ones who are going to build those core primitives, the modules. But are you going to train all 5,000 people on Terraform? Probably not. It's not a good use of their time. They're focused on building their application. So, okay, your first 500 people are running the platform. That becomes where you then implement something like Waypoint. So then the next 4,000 people, they can use Waypoint. They don't have to learn Terraform. They don't have to be experts in the infrastructure. And I think that builds on top of the transformation. So you're 100% right. There is an org transformation, but I actually think it happens earlier than Waypoint. Then to your question, like how are we investing to help make that easier? I think it's a number of things. One is we're trying to get more prescriptive about how should this be done right? So we're working with people like Amazon and Azure and Google to create the landing zones, to create policy as code out of the box, to say, okay, you're building an EKS app, here's what it should look like. Here's the modules, here's the templates, here's policy for it. We're going to be more opinionated. Then what we're working on internally is what we call the HashiCorp validated designs. It's kind of our reference architectures of how should the products be deployed, how should they be used, how should they be integrated. So we've built that as both internal enablement and training for our sales engineers and our sellers, but also enabling our partners on the same thing. So as a customer, if you're bringing in one of our partners that's trained on it, then they're going to have the same reference architecture that we've built and hardened, basically. So trying to get more prescriptive. And then third is moving it to cloud. right? I think what we see a lot of organizations struggle with is having the skill sets to operate these things, to integrate all these tools. So moving into cloud makes it a lot easier because it's like, great, we can be opinionated, we can operate it for you, we can keep it up to date, back it up, all of that kind of good stuff. So maybe a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of different things going into it. But you're right, it is an org transformation, and there's a lot that goes into that, but trying to make it prescriptive, trying to give the patterns, trying to enable our partners and ecosystem, that's a lot of the work that's going into it. Good question. Okay, other questions? Maybe folks in the front area have been quiet.
Here.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Armon, for explaining about Waypoint. And I see that you are doing a lot of work on IDP side for Waypoint. But for example, like nowadays, the product that first comes to the market captures like a lot of pace. For example, I want to talk about Backstage. Many enterprise companies have already adopted Backstage and start using it. So how would you differentiate these two? What is your opinion on to the customers who are running both Backstage and who want to adopt Waypoint?
Yeah, great question. So maybe I'll repeat it for folks, which is how do we think about Waypoint vis-a-vis Backstage? How do they sort of relate to each other? And for enterprises that already have adopted Backstage, where would Waypoint sit in that? It's a great question. So I think the interesting challenge is actually, even before we started with Waypoint, we internally started with Backstage. And I think the challenge with Backstage is that it's a framework for a front-end application. I mean, it's a set of React pages, basically, is what it is. So it's not truly an orchestration engine, and it doesn't have a prescriptive domain model in terms of how it works. And the problem is, without a domain model, then it doesn't really have things like role-based access control. It doesn't really have policy in a way that makes sense. It's modeled as a web app. So yeah, you can restrict who can go to what paths, but that's not the same as having a domain model of a user who's executing an action in development versus staging versus production. That requires you have a domain model of what's an environment, what's an application, what's an action, which user is allowed to run what action in what environment. So can you build all of that into Backstage? Sure, but then your Backstage will end up being completely unique to you. Right? At that point, you're not really using a product. You've just completely customized it using a framework at that point. It's a bespoke thing that you're building and maintaining internally. So that's exactly the problem we ran into internally. We took Backstage, we were building and customizing it to be our own internal developer portal, and we're like, it's now so heavily customized, has nothing to do with the community edition. And so we sort of looked at it and said, okay, everyone's going to have the same problem. So how do you instead say, okay, well, what we're trying to do with Waypoint is to be prescriptive and create a domain model, right? So what you saw was in the demos, for example, is we have a first class notion of you have applications, there's templates, there's add-ons, there's actions, there's users and groups and permission models associated with all that. And then all of that is backed by an API-driven model. So our goal is that you can almost think about Waypoint as being sort of, in some sense, the brains of the system. It will have a domain model and a hierarchy. When you start thinking about action orchestration, for example, you might have multiple networks. Development, staging, and production are different networks that they're in. So with Waypoint, the runners, the Waypoint agents, you might have many of them because they're in different environments. One's in Google, Azure, on-prem, et cetera. So you kind of need an orchestration engine that's aware of all those things. So when the developer pushes the build button, in what environment do I run GitHub Action? When they push deploy, where am I talking to Helm? All of those things start to matter. So you kind of need an orchestration engine that understands those pieces. Now, our view is that most companies will want to customize what that front-end UI looks like. They want to put your own workflows, use your own internal language, tie it into your other systems, customize the look and feel of it. So our view is that's where you're going to use Backstage because it's great. It's designed to be a flexible front-end configurable tool. It's easy. Anyone can write some React pages and make the front-end look what they want it to do. But then you could use Waypoint as the back end of it, if you will. So you can almost think about Waypoint as you could run it, using its native UI, or you could run it headless, where it's providing the role-based access control, the policy, the state management, the orchestration, and then you put Backstage in front as sort of a UI. Because I think otherwise what ends up happening is you're going to have to build your entire own custom permissioning model, orchestration model, networking model, which will end up being unique, effectively. And that's kind of an architectural limitation of Backstage. Hopefully that helps.
There's another one up here.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I think. So I wanted to ask. You talked about today a lot about the infrastructure cloud, and for me it would be interesting. What do you see as the big next steps in the infrastructure cloud? So what's coming there?
Yeah, great question. So I think the question was sort of we talked about the infrastructure cloud at a high level. How do we think about sort of what's next and where is that going? I think the biggest piece, and I sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier when I was talking about sort of that data lake, is today a lot of what HCP manages is the pieces that we know about. You're already managing it with Terraform. What it doesn't manage is the things it doesn't know about outside of what you're potentially managing with things like Terraform today. So I think a big challenge for a lot of companies operating at scale is that's great if I was 100% in Terraform, but for most people they're not, right? They're starting from a legacy environment. They had ClickOps, they had lift and shift migration, they had a bunch of other things. So the question becomes, okay, can you give me visibility over that whole thing, right? Can I understand what are all my resources everywhere? Can you give me a path to bring them into a modern infrastructure as infrastructure as code? So give me a workflow so I can import existing infrastructure. Give me a consistent way to apply policy controls over that whole thing. And that's a lot of where we want to sort of go, is to really say, okay, there's a set of secrets in Vault, but there's a set of secrets not in Vault. Okay, how can we solve that with things like Radar? There's a set of resources managed by Terraform, but there's things not in Terraform. How do we help you bring that? So what's the Radar equivalent of Terraform, right? And so if you start thinking about it through that lens, that's kind of where we want to take infrastructure cloud, is to really say, okay, this becomes sort of the one portal that helps you sort of import and manage everything. And then you can apply modern practices around secret management, infrastructure as code, policy in a consistent way across it. But I think today what ends up happening is it's a very fragmented estate, and most organizations don't have the visibility on that. And then the workflows are very manual in terms of trying to modernize. So how do we make it a more automated workflow in terms of how you modernize? But yeah, great question. I think there was one up front here.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm Oliver from Commerzbank, and I'm interested in your recommendation regarding Terraform modules. So what we currently see is we have the nice resources from the providers, and we have open source modules that typically also are quite nice. And then we are currently facing the problem, and this would be the first question, with the HCL language.
Yeah.
Do you think that this is currently in a state that makes it easy enough to extend a module for internal corporate usage? And then the second thing is, so we discussed this already with Christian this morning, how many people it takes inside a company to have those specialized, specific need modules that we want to use, and what your recommendation would be to tackle this problem. So is it have 10 guys that only manage Terraform modules, or something else?
Okay, great question. So maybe if I summarize it a little bit, it's how do you think about sort of, as a large enterprise, how do you maintain and build sort of your internal library of modules and keep up to date with some of the public ones that exist, and sort of leverage that work? And what does it look like organizationally to build and maintain that? So it's a super good question. I think for most organizations, the right starting point is some of the, I'll call them community modules, but not necessarily the kind of random ones, because there's a lot out there. I would say the start point is really the cloud ones. So we work closely with Amazon, Microsoft, Google. They publish their landing zones or their well-architected frameworks, depending on what cloud you're in, where they're effectively jointly developed between us and Microsoft, Amazon, Google, et cetera. And here's what we think is best practice for most of the common patterns, right? So I think that's the right start point for most enterprises, is start with that. To the extent you need to customize it, great, I would fork those and build on top of those. For most enterprises, they're pretty flexible. They have a lot of the tuning flags and inputs so that you shouldn't have to fork them. You should be able to just use the existing landing zones as they're published. But I would start there because they're going to get you 90+% of the way. So then if I think about it, sort of there's a layering, right? To me, there's very primitive core ones like VPC networking and things like that. Those are super foundational layers, right? Then you're going to get into middleware, which is going to be your databases, your message queues, your things like that. And then you're going to get to the very top level, which is your application pattern, right? It's my Java app, it's my C#, it's whatever. To me, I think the most reusable is you're going to get to it's those bottom layers. It's the VPCs, things like that, where you can reuse from the landing zones that exist. I think most organizations end up being differentiated enough at those other two layers, app layer and middleware, because one group is on Red Hat, another group is on Ubuntu, a third group's on Windows, right? So it's just it's too different by enterprise, where I think those are the two layers where I build a team internally to build and maintain those. Now, I think the good thing is there's really probably 20 to 30 patterns you're going to get the most leverage out of. If you think about middleware, database, MQ, cache, et cetera, how many of those patterns do you have? Probably 10, 15 of them, right? If you think at the app layer, most organizations, it's 5 to 10, Java, C#, Python, et cetera. You probably don't have that many patterns. So the core library is probably really 20 to 30 that are going to be really high value. Now, you might have a long tail of other ones, but I think if you can really have a team that maintains those 20 to 30, that becomes the highest value, right? Does that need to be a team of 10 people? Probably not. That might be a little bit heavy, right? It can probably be a smaller team than that if it's really 20, 30 modules, because they shouldn't change a whole lot, right? If you think about my core database pattern, it's not changing a lot once I've built it, right? My Java pattern is not really changing, right? So I think what a lot of people just do is they might work with a partner to help them kind of surge and say, hey, come in, I have 0 modules, build my first 30, and then enable a small team of people who are maintaining it, because the ongoing maintenance is relatively lightweight. You're not changing very often, but there's an upfront work of saying, okay, what are all the security agents I use? What are all the databases? What's all the patterns? Let's build the first 30. And then, you might have 2 or 3 people that are actually maintaining it on an ongoing basis. Or some people just have a partner maintain it for them, and that way they don't even have to have it in-house. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. Awesome. Any other questions? Have we exhausted them all? That's okay. Yeah. 3 in this case.
This will be the last question.
Hey, lucky me. Thanks first of all for being this open and answering questions. But my question would be, you have various different marvelous products in various different ways, like we've heard this morning, regarding HCP. So how would it look like in the future for feature parity, let's say Vault HCP or Vault Enterprise? What's the plan there, and where are you guys moving?
Yeah, super good question. So maybe summarize it for folks that didn't hear. Obviously, you heard a lot about HCP today, and the question was like, what does that mean when we think about parity of the products between, maybe something like HCP Vault versus Vault Enterprise kind of moving forward? So this ties back, I think, to the earlier point I was making about our views that fundamentally I think the world's going to be hybrid, right? So for us, we don't think, if I flash forward 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I don't think the world's 100% cloud, right? I think there's going to be a healthy mix of self-managed, air-gap environments, private data centers plus cloud. So for us, our view is basically we want to architect for that world. So to the largest extent possible, we're designing around parity between the products. We want to have as much feature parity as we can, because we don't want there to be a huge difference. Now, at the same time, I think there's a reality, there's a set of capabilities that's just very difficult for us to deliver self-managed, right? So some of the AI stuff we've done to date, for example, it's only available in the cloud products because it's very impractical for us to tell a customer, give me a 500 GPU cluster to use this feature, right? Nobody's going to do that. Some of the data lake capabilities I was talking about, again, it's very impractical for me to say, give me a Snowflake and an Elastic cluster and a Cassandra and a scale-out database. Nobody's going to operate that. So I think what we're looking at is saying, okay, to the largest extent, we want to design to keep as much feature parity as we can. There's going to be some capabilities that'll be cloud only. Even for some of the stuff that's cloud only, we want to try and enable it that's hybrid. So you might be able to say, okay, maybe I'm self-managing Vault Enterprise on-prem, but I want to connect it, for example, to Radar, because I'm doing the correlation feature to say, hey, this matches a secret in Vault. So that's a great example of a hybrid capability where you might be self-managing Vault Enterprise, but you're still leveraging part of that capability on correlation, which is cloud delivered. So it's not all or nothing. You don't have to be all in an HCP Vault to get that feature. It could be self-managed as well. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it, is like, great, even if I'm running self-managed Terraform Enterprise, could I leverage some of those cloud capabilities for some of the data lake stuff, and could those things be connected to each other? So that's kind of my goal, is if you say 5 years from now, you can still run most of these things self-managed in the way you do today. Maybe you have 90% of the same capabilities. 10% might be only in cloud because it's impractical to operate it. And then hopefully if you're willing to be hybrid, right, if you're not purely air-gapped, right, if you're a submarine, it's hard. But if you have internet and you can be connected to HCP, then okay, great, you might still be able to leverage some of those capabilities, right? And that way you can say, I have most of my data, I control things on-prem for specific features, I might be willing to use it. But if you don't want that feature, you don't have to, turn on the cloud connection. And I think that becomes sort of a good balancing act of our ability to deliver new capabilities, but solve for hybrid. Awesome.
Great. Well, Armon, thank you, as always, for spending the time with our community, discussing a little bit more in depth some of the more hot topics as well. Always a pleasure to share the stage with you. And to everyone here, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's a huge commitment to take a day off like this and, spend it with some people that sometimes you don't know at the beginning, but hopefully you've gotten a lot out of this, both with networking, some of the round tables, customer as well, and then a question and answer. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you next year.
Yeah.